should be Teilot, Philos, Tzedakah. So first of all, everybody should give Tzedakah. And we have the honor today to have a Choshev Yoman, Chaim, Borch, הכהן, טייטלבוים, המלמד, Shiva, on Choshev Yolai. So come give us some insight into Binyan Beis Hamikdash, Sharav Teitlbaum. Go.
All right, in Parshas Truma, it speaks about the Klei HaMishkan. So the first of the Kalim is the Aron, and the Torah begins speaking about the measurements of the Aron. Also, Aron Atzei Shittim, the Amasayim V'Chetzi Arkei, how the dimensions were. It goes on to speak about how it would be coated with gold on the inside and the outside. They made Badei Aron, with which they would carry it. And then the section of the Parsha ends off, the section of that, those Psukim end off, in this Aron, you should put the Eidos. Eidos, Rashi explains, means the Torah, which is an Eidos between Hashem and the Yidden. The Luchos were placed inside the Torah, inside the Aron. That's the first section. Then there's Sheni and Nu Aliyah, and then it goes on to speak about something else. It speaks about the Kaperis, the lid on the Aron. And again, it says the dimensions, Amasayim V'Chetzi Arka, Ama V'Chetzi Rachba, and then it says on the Kaperis you should have Keruvim, they should be mikshet tasayisam, they should be made from the same piece of gold as the kaperes itself, and they should be on either side of the kaperes. These two keruvim should be on either side, their wings should be spread out, and then after the whole description, it ends up saying, this lid, this cover should be placed upon the aron, on top of it, and then it ends off saying something very similar to before, and inside the Aron, you shall place the Eidos, which I will give to you. So all the Mefarshim right away ask, we know already that the Luchos have to be placed inside the Aron. Why does the Torah say it twice? Once after describing the dimensions of the Aron itself, and then again the same exact words, or almost the exact same words, after describing the Kaperes, the lid of the Aron. So Rashi comments on the repetition. And Rashi says in words, he says, Lo yadaiti lo manichbal. He doesn't know why this was repeated. If Rashi doesn't know, it must be a very big question. But nonetheless, Rashi still continues and says, V'yesh leimar, an explanation for it is as follows. It's teaching us, shebe'edei arin levade b'lei kaperes. When there's just an arin without a lid upon it, that's when you should put the eidos inside of it. And then we find later on as well, when they actually built the Mishkan in Parshas Yaakov Pekudei, it says that they first made the Aron, then they put the Eidos inside of it, and afterwards they put the lid on top. So interestingly, it speaks about making the lid of the Aron. After that it says, V'el ha'aron yiten es ha'eidos. Rashi says it's teaching us that you put the Eidos into the Aron before they place the lid upon the Aron. And the emphasis is, it says, it's a good question. And the emphasis is El ha'aron when it's an Aron levadai, b'loi kaperes. When it says you should put it in the Aron, Rashi says the Torah is emphasizing it while it's only an Aron without a lid on it, which means that we could have somehow made a mistake. Some of Farshim explained the mistake we could have made was that the Eidos had to be placed up top of the Aron, not inside. El ha'aron means before you put the lid on, while it's still open, put it inside and then cover it with the lid. Anyhow, that is the way Rashi explains it. So again, the Rashi himself starts off saying he doesn't know why the Torah repeats it, but he says it's mechadish to us that the Aron, the Eidos are being placed in the Aron before the lid is covering the Aron. After the Eidos were put in, then they would put the lid up on it. Now the Ramban quotes the Rashi as usual and argues. The Ramban says that this is not what the pasuk could be meaning, because the meaning of the word Aron is a box which has automatically a lid on it too. When you say place the Eidos, put the luchos in the Aron, it indicates in a closed box, not in an open box. When we say the word Aron levate, how would we define the word Aron? Is the word Aron just a box without a lid on it, or does the word Aron include a cover on it? According to the Ramban, the word Aron includes a lid on it, and therefore, when you say the words "you shall place in the Aron the Eidos," it indicates a closed box. Therefore, he says that this is not what the Torah is teaching us by repeating itself. Instead, he goes on to give an entirely different explanation. He says that the Torah, after explaining all the dinim of the aring, it went on to explain a strange idea of the lid. Now, the lid itself is very clear, but then it says kruvim, there would be mixture, it would be chiseled out, and it would have wings, and there would be spreading out outwards. And the Ramban says that there is no indication of what this was for and what purpose it held. What was it accomplishing? So according to the Ramban, the repetition is explaining to us why they made the kruvim and the kaperes. The purpose of it was to be upon the eidos. The Torah, after saying the whole arichos about the lid, it ends up repeating itself when it says, and you shall place the kaperes, the lid, on the arin, and in the arin should be the eidos, indicating that the entire purpose of the lid and the kruvim were because of the eidos. And he goes on to explain at length how when Yechezkel Hanavi saw the Merkava, he saw a chariot of malachim carrying the Shechina, so to speak. Those malachim were called kruvim. And he says that the physical kruvim that were placed on the arin they reflect, and they're similar to the chayes which were noises as hakise. And he says that in the what schus do the malachim have the ability to carry the Shechina, and what schus does the Shechina rest upon these malachim? It's b'schus the Torah which were ksuvim be'etzva, they came the luchos that were inside the arin. So he says again, the reason why the Torah here repeats itself, saying you should put the arin inside you should put the eidos inside the arin, is to explain to us the reason why Hashem commanded us to make the keruvim and the kaperes. Okay, so before we go on, there's a couple of, practically speaking, the question is the arin a box with a lid on it, or is the arin a box without a lid on it? In other words, according to the opinion of Rashi, there were two kelim in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. There was an arin, that's one keli, which is an open box. In the arin, you place the eidos, the luchos. There was a separate keli called kaperes. It had nothing to do with the luchos that were placed inside the arin. This was a separate keli, which it happened to be placed upon the arin. There were two kelim, one on top of the other. The arin on the bottom and the kaperes was on top. According to the Ramban, the arin needs a combination of them both. Now, before we're going to explain the differences in halacha between these two opinions, there's a few indications that support Rashi's opinion. First of all, in the Torah itself, it speaks about placing the poles on the arin. The poles are meant to carry the arin. Ordinarily, you first create the keli, then you would make the poles with which you would carry the keli. Here in the Torah, it says about making the arin, the box. It says you should make tabais, rings. It says you should put poles under the beams, in the rings with which to carry the arin, and only afterwards to speak about the lid. That indicates that the lid is a new keli. Obviously, the lid didn't need any special way to be carried because it was carried along with the arin. But it seems to separate them as two separate kelim. Another indication of how we see that the arin was separate and a keli for itself is in Gemara Sukkah when discussing the smallest measurement that a sukkah can be. It says that a sukkah smaller than 10 tefachim is possible. What's the reason? The first attempt the Gemara gives to answer it is because the arin was 10 tefachim tall. And we see that the Shechina came down until 10 tefachim, not lower than 10 tefachim. So 10 tefachim is a reshus b'fnei atzmai, so a sukkah has to be at least 10 tefachim tall to be kosher. And the Gemara says, how do we know that arin was 10 tefachim tall? We know that it was the arin itself was amma v'chetzi kaimasai, so that's 9 tefachim. And amma 6 tefachim, amma v'chetzi, amma and a half is 9 tefachim. How do we know how big the lid was? So the Gemara says that everything in the Torah, when it discusses the kelim of the Mishkan, it says the measurements. The one exception is the height of the lid. It says how wide it was. It says clearly in the Torah that the asisa kaperes amasayim v'chetzi arka v'ama v'chetzi rachba. It doesn't say how tall it was. And the Gemara says if it doesn't say clearly, it has to be the same size as the smallest keli we find elsewhere. We see that the misgaris of the Mishkan was a tefach, so it has to be that the lid of the arin was also a tefach. The Gemara has many questions on that. Why do we say compared to the tzitz? So we say no, a tzitz is only a tachshit, it was an ornament that was being worn, not a keli. We say compared to the zer, the crown around the shulchan, and the Gemara says no, that's only hechsher keli. It's not a keli for itself. Now those words of the Gemara indicating that the zer was a hechsher keli, and the lid of the arin, what was that? Wasn't that only a part of the arin? It indicates that no, the kaperes was a separate keli on its own. It wasn't a part of the arin, but it was the hechsher keli. To close the arin, it needed a lid to complete the use of the keli of the arin. Rather, it was a completely separate keli that was independent of the arin. It just happened to be placed on top of it. So these two things seem to prove how Rashi supports the opinion of Rashi. The differences in these two views in halacha are as follows. First of all, a kli sharis has to be paid for with mamin tzibor, with the money paid for by all the yidden. It cannot be paid for by an individual. Kli sharis were served in the kelim in the Mishkan that were used to serve for the Avodah of the klal have to be paid for by the klal. Now, on Yom Kippur, they would sprinkle the blood towards the lid of the aron. Now, if you're going to say that the entire aron was one keli, the entire aron is a kli sharis, and it has to be paid for by all the yidden. But according to Rashi, that there were two separate kelim, only the lid was a kli sharis. The aron itself was not. And the Rogatchover points out on this. We find that the one time the Torah speaks about, when it says in Pash Pekudei, the Vayas Betzalel, it goes through all the different kelim that he made. It says Vayas Betzalel Sa'aron, and it doesn't say it by any other kelim. Why is that? He said the aron was the one thing. It wasn't the kli sharis. It could be made by a yachid. It didn't have to be made with the mamin atzib, or it didn't have to be paid for by everyone. The lid was the kli sharis, and the shulchan was the kli sharis, and the everything else which were used for the avodah saklal. And another nafkamina, besides for how it has to be paid for, the kelim of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Mishkan had to be made lishma. And that explains not only l'shem hamish, l'shem the Beis Hamikdash, but it has to be with a kavana pratis l'shem that specific kelim. So now, if a person was making the kapeiros with the kavana that he's making an aron, is that proper? Is that the way to make the kapeiros? According to the Ramban, the kapeiros is a part of the aron. So you have to have kavana for the kedusha of the aron. According to Rashi, it's not an aron; it's a different keli. You have to have a specific kavana l'shem kedusha sakapeiros. Another difference between these two opinions are there's an issur to make a replica of the kelim of the Mishkan for your own self. Now, what happens if a person wants to just make the aron without the lid? Is that okay? Is it a half a keli, which that would be allowed? Or is it a separate keli on its own, and therefore should not be allowed? According to Rashi, you can't make an aron even if there's no lid on it. According to the Ramban, it's okay just to make the aron, because there was no keli in the Mishkan, that was just an open box. The aron in the Kodesh HaKodashim was a box with the kaperis and the kruvim all together as one. There's an interesting Rambam in Hillchot Abchira that discusses examples of things that you know how to make for yourself. It says you can't make a heichel like for yourself, like the heichel in the Beis Hamikdash. You can't make a shulchan like the shulchan in the Beis Hamikdash, and so on. And it doesn't mention there the aron. And the Mefarshim wonder, why is the aron not mentioned there? It mentions the shulchan, the menorah, I think the mizbeach also. Why doesn't it mention over there the aron? So the Minchas Chinuch tries to give an answer that perhaps since the aron has to be made complete with a lid, and in the lid there were the kruvim, and the kruvim are in the shape of malachim, and it says that it's also to make the image of those who serve Hashem in the heavens, which the Gemara explains refers to malachim. Therefore, we already know you know how to make the aron. Therefore, the Rambam doesn't have to mention it separately over here. This explanation fits only according to the Ramban. According to Rashi, however, it would have to say a specific issur making the aron without kruvim, because they're two separate kelim. Yeah, time up. You go for all longer.
Very interesting.
One more thing here. Okay, this one more point. This is connected very much with another machlekes between Rashi and Ramban. What was the image of the face of the kruvim? According to Rashi, we see that it says that it was the face of a teenage, a young child. Kruvim are the shape of the images on top of the lid of the aron, with wings and a face. We don't know what type of face did they have. According to Rashi, it was the face of a young child. According to the Ramban, it was the face of malachim, just like the chayis taronesis akise. And this fits very well with the general machlekes between Rashi and Ramban. According to the Rashi, the aron was there for the tayar, for the luchais. The lid of the aron had a separate kavana, a separate objective, and that was Hashem spoke to the Yidden from upon the aron. The psukim over here say it very clearly. Hashem says, the purpose of the kaperes with the kruvim was for Hashem to speak to Yidden, nothing to do with the Torah placed underneath it. According to the Ramban, the entire point of the kruvim was because of the schus of the Torah that was underneath it. Therefore, according to the Ramban, that the luchais were the cause for the kedusha and the shechina that came down between the kruvim. The kruvim were similar to malachim, which were only able to draw down the shechina because of the schus of the Torah. However, according to Rashi, which Rashi says it's separate, he says that the kedusha that was drawn down in the Mishkan was because of the Yidden's essential connection to Hashem, which is higher and greater than Torah, and therefore is the face of a child, like it says in the pasuk, Yinar Yisrael va'aveu, and just like the love that a parent has for a young child is an ava atzmis, regardless of his behavior, so too the Shechina that came down between the Kruvim and spoke to the Yidden was in the schus of the essential connection and the love that Hashem has for Yidden higher than them following the ways of Torah.